Sarah Martinez stepped onto the dusty training ground at Camp Pendleton, her worn sneakers crunching against the gravel. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the California base, but she barely noticed the heat. Her focus was entirely on the group of Marines gathered near the practice ring, their muscular frames casting long shadows across the sand. At 22, Sarah looked nothing like what most people expected from someone claiming to have martial arts expertise. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing only 125 pounds, she appeared fragile next to the towering figures of the seasoned Marines. Her long black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her plain gray t-shirt and worn jeans gave no hint of the years of intensive training hidden beneath her unassuming exterior. The invitation to demonstrate her skills at the military base had come through her former instructor, Master Chen, who had served as a combat trainer for Special Forces units. When the base commander heard about Sarah's background in multiple martial arts disciplines, he decided to organize an informal demonstration. What he didn't expect was the skeptical reception she would receive from his men. As Sarah approached the group, conversations gradually died down. The Marines turned to study her with expressions ranging from curious to openly dismissive. Sergeant Rodriguez, a barrel-chested man with arms like tree trunks, was the first to speak up. His voice carried across the training area with barely concealed amusement. "So you're telling me this little girl is supposed to teach us something about fighting?" he said, looking around at his fellow Marines for support. "I've been in combat zones for 8 years, and I've never seen anything this small take down anything bigger than a house cat." Laughter rippled through the group, and Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She had encountered this type of reaction before, but it never got easier. The assumptions people made based on her appearance had followed her throughout her martial arts journey. From her first day at the dojo when she was 12 years old to her black belt tests in 3 different disciplines, Corporal Jackson, a lanky man with a thick Southern accent, stepped forward with a grin. "Maybe she's here to show us some of those fancy movie moves," he drawled. "You know, the kind where people fly through the air and break wooden boards with their pinky fingers." The mockery continued as more Marines joined in, their voices growing louder and more confident. Private Wilson, barely older than Sarah herself, shook his head in disbelief. "I mean no disrespect, miss, but what could someone like you possibly teach us about real fighting? We train for actual combat situations where lives are on the line." Sarah stood silently in the center of the growing circle, her hands clasped behind her back. She had learned long ago that arguing with skeptics only made them more determined to prove their point. Instead, she focused on the breathing techniques Master Chen had taught her, allowing the insults and jokes to wash over her without taking root in her mind. The base commander, Colonel Williams, watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. He had personally reviewed Sarah's credentials and knew about her tournament victories and teaching experience, but seeing his men's reaction made him question his decision to invite her. The last thing he wanted was for this demonstration to become a humiliating spectacle for either party. "Gentlemen," the colonel finally interrupted, his authoritative voice cutting through the laughter. "Ms. Martinez comes highly recommended by Master Chen, who has trained some of our most elite units. I think we should show her the respect she deserves and see what she has to offer." But the damage was already done. The Marines had made up their minds about what they expected from this demonstration, and their body language made it clear they were merely going through the motions out of respect for their commanding officer. Several continued to exchange knowing glances and barely suppressed smirks. Sarah could feel the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. Every instinct told her to walk away, to avoid the inevitable embarrassment that seemed to await her. She thought about all the hours she had spent training, the sacrifices she had made, and the dedication that had earned her recognition in martial arts circles across the country. The irony wasn't lost on her that these same men who dismissed her so casually would likely struggle to match her flexibility, precision, or technical knowledge, but she also understood their perspective. In their world, size and strength often meant the difference between life and death, and her appearance suggested neither. As the Marines continued their casual conversation, making jokes at her expense, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She stepped forward slightly, her voice calm but carrying enough authority to capture everyone's attention. "I understand your concerns," she said, her words measured and respectful. "Physical appearance can be deceiving, and I don't expect you to take my abilities on faith. If you're willing, I'd like to demonstrate some techniques that might challenge your assumptions about what makes an effective fighter. The training ground fell silent as 30 pairs of eyes focused on the small woman standing before them. The moment of truth had arrived, and everyone present seemed to sense that what happened next would either validate their skepticism or force them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about combat effectiveness. Colonel Williams stepped forward, sensing the tension in the air. The mockery had gone far enough, and he could see the determination in Sarah's eyes that reminded him of the most dedicated soldiers he had commanded. Despite his men's skepticism, he had done his homework on this young woman, and her credentials were nothing short of impressive. "All right, listen up," the colonel announced, his voice commanding immediate attention from every Marine present. "Ms. Martinez has agreed to demonstrate some techniques. I want volunteers for a controlled sparring session. Who's willing to step up?" The request was met with an eager show of hands. Nearly every Marine present raised their arm, confident in their ability to prove their point about size and strength. The grins on their faces suggested they viewed this as an opportunity for easy entertainment, rather than a legitimate learning experience. Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to volunteer, his massive frame casting a shadow over Sarah as he stepped into the makeshift ring. At 6 feet 3 inches and weighing nearly 240 pounds of solid muscle, he represented everything the Marines believed about combat effectiveness. His hands alone were larger than Sarah's head, and his reach advantage seemed almost comical. "I'll take it easy on you," Rodriguez said with what he probably thought was kindness. But his tone carried an unmistakable condescension. "Just try to show us whatever it is you think you can do, and I'll make sure nobody gets hurt." Sarah nodded politely, but those who knew her well would have recognized the subtle change in her posture. Her spine straightened almost imperceptibly, her weight shifted slightly onto the balls of her feet, and her breathing became deeper and more controlled. These were the unconscious preparations of someone who had spent years training their body to respond instantly to threat situations. The other Marines formed a loose circle around the pair, their conversations filled with predictions about how quickly this demonstration would end. Private Chen, the only Asian American in the unit, felt a twinge of sympathy for Sarah but kept his thoughts to himself. He had grown up hearing stories about martial arts masters from his grandmother, but even he struggled to believe that someone so small could pose any real challenge to Rodriguez. The key to effective combat isn't always about overpowering your opponent, Sarah explained to the gathered crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the training ground. Sometimes it's about understanding leverage, timing, and using your opponent's strength against them. Rodriguez chuckled, rolling his massive shoulders to loosen up. "That sounds real nice in theory, little lady. But when someone my size comes at you, all that fancy footwork isn't going to help much." Colonel Williams raised his hand to signal the beginning of the demonstration. He had established clear rules: controlled contact only, no strikes to the head or groin, and immediate cessation if he called for a stop. What he didn't anticipate was how quickly his carefully planned demonstration would spiral beyond anyone's expectations. Rodriguez approached, Sarah with the casual confidence of someone who had never lost a physical confrontation. His plan was simple: close the distance quickly, wrap her up in a bear hug, and gently but firmly demonstrate the reality of their size difference. He had used similar tactics countless times during training exercises with smaller opponents. Sarah watched his approach with the focused intensity of a chess master studying an opponent's opening move. Years of training had taught her to read body language like a language, and Rodriguez's telegraphed movements were as obvious to her as road signs. His weight was distributed incorrectly, his guard was too low, and his overconfidence had made him predictable. As Rodriguez reached for her, Sarah moved with a fluidity that seemed to defy physics. She stepped slightly to her left, just outside his reaching arms, and in one smooth motion grabbed his extended wrist, while pivoting her entire body. The movement was so quick that many of the watching Marines weren't sure what they had seen. Rodriguez found himself suddenly off balance, his momentum carrying him forward while his arm was trapped in an unexpected position. Before he could adjust, Sarah had stepped behind him and applied a joint lock that sent shooting pain up his arm and forced him to his knees to avoid injury. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. The training ground fell silent except for Rodriguez's sharp intake of breath as he felt the precise pressure Sarah was applying to his wrist and elbow. She held the position just long enough for everyone to understand what had happened, then immediately released him and stepped back. The principle here is redirection rather than resistance, Sarah explained calmly, as if she hadn't just taken down a man twice her size. When someone commits their full weight to an attack, they become vulnerable to techniques that use their momentum against them. Rodriguez slowly got to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment and disbelief. He flexed his arm experimentally, checking for damage, and found only a slight soreness where Sarah had applied the lock. The technique had been executed with perfect control, demonstrating not just skill but remarkable restraint. The Marines exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence beginning to waver. What they had just witnessed didn't fit into their understanding of how combat worked. Size and strength were supposed to be decisive advantages, yet Rodriguez had been neutralized so quickly that some of them had missed the actual technique. Corporal Jackson stepped forward, his southern drawl now carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than mockery. "That was unexpected," he admitted. "But Rodriguez wasn't really trying to hurt you. What happens when someone comes at you with real intent?" Sarah smiled, recognizing both the challenge and the opportunity in his question. "That's actually when these techniques become most effective," she replied. "The more force and aggression someone brings to an attack, the more energy I have to work with." The atmosphere on the training ground had shifted dramatically. Where moments before there had been casual dismissal and barely concealed laughter, now there was a growing sense of uncertainty. The Marines found themselves witnessing something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about combat, and their reactions ranged from curiosity to outright skepticism about what they had just seen. Corporal Jackson stepped into the ring, his approach markedly different from Rodriguez's casual confidence. As someone who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and earned commendations for hand-to-hand combat, Jackson understood that dismissing any opponent could be a fatal mistake. His movements were more measured, more tactical, as he circled Sarah like a predator sizing up potential prey. "All right, let's see how those fancy moves work when someone isn't playing around," Jackson said, his voice carrying a harder edge than before. The humor had completely drained from his expression, replaced by the focused intensity he typically reserved for actual combat situations. Sarah recognized the change in his demeanor immediately. This wouldn't be the straightforward attack that Rodriguez had attempted. Jackson was thinking, analyzing, looking for weaknesses and opportunities. His stance was lower, his guard was higher, and his eyes never left hers as he moved around the perimeter of their makeshift ring. The watching Marines sensed the elevated tension. Private Wilson found himself holding his breath, while Sergeant Rodriguez rubbed his still sore wrist and watched with newfound respect for the small woman who had so easily neutralized him. Even Colonel Williams leaned forward slightly, his military bearing unable to completely mask his growing interest in how this encounter would unfold. Jackson's attack, when it came, was nothing like Rodriguez's amateur approach. He feinted left, then explosively drove forward with his right shoulder, attempting to tackle Sarah around the waist while keeping his center of gravity low. It was a textbook military takedown, the kind of move that had served him well in close-quarters combat situations overseas. But Sarah had been training for scenarios exactly like this since she was a teenager. Her response was instantaneous and precise. As Jackson committed to his tackle, she dropped her weight slightly and twisted her torso, allowing his momentum to carry him past her while she maintained perfect balance. Her hands found pressure points on his neck and shoulder that most people didn't even know existed. What happened next appeared almost supernatural to the untrained eye. Jackson's forward momentum suddenly became a liability as Sarah guided his movement in a direction he hadn't intended to go. His legs tangled beneath him, his balance completely disrupted by the unexpected change in direction, and he found himself airborne for a split second before hitting the ground hard. The impact drove the air from Jackson's lungs in a sharp whoosh that echoed across the silent training ground. He lay on his back, staring up at the California sky, trying to process what had just happened to him. One moment he had been executing a perfect tackle, and the next he was flat on his back with Sarah standing calmly beside him, not even breathing hard. The key principle there is called blending, Sarah explained to the stunned audience as Jackson slowly sat up. Instead of meeting force with force, you join with your opponent's energy and redirect it. His own speed and strength became the tools for his downfall. Private Wilson, barely 20 years old and still relatively new to the Marines, couldn't contain his amazement. "How did you even see that coming?" He was moving so fast I could barely follow it. Sarah helped Jackson to his feet, her assistance both practical and symbolic. Training develops what we call mushin, a state of no mind where your body responds without conscious thought. When you've practiced the same movements thousands of times, your muscle memory takes over faster than rational thinking can process what's happening. Jackson dusted himself off, his face reflecting a mixture of embarrassment and grudging admiration. "I've been in real fights, life or death situations, and I've never been taken down that clean," he admitted. "Where did you learn to do that?" The question opened a door for Sarah to share something more personal about her journey. "I started training when I was 12 because I was being bullied at school. Kids thought I was an easy target because of my size. My parents enrolled me in a traditional karate dojo, but I quickly realized that one style wasn't enough if I wanted to be truly effective." She gestured toward the Marines, who were now listening with genuine attention rather than polite tolerance. "Over the next 10 years, I studied 7 different martial arts styles. Karate gave me striking fundamentals. Judo taught me throws and ground control. Aikido showed me how to use an attacker's force against them. And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu rounded out my grappling skills." The transformation in her audience was remarkable. Men who had been making jokes about her appearance 15 minutes earlier were now hanging on every word, asking technical questions about leverage and timing. The demonstration had evolved from a show-and-tell session into an impromptu seminar on combat effectiveness. Sergeant Martinez, a compact man with quick eyes and calloused knuckles, raised his hand. "All that sounds impressive, but what about multiple attackers? Everything you've shown us is one-on-one, but real fights don't always work that way." It was exactly the opening Sarah had been hoping for. "You're absolutely right," she replied, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Multiple attackers require completely different strategies. The techniques I've demonstrated so far are just the foundation. When you're outnumbered, survival depends on movement, positioning, and the ability to neutralize threats quickly before they can coordinate against you." The Marines exchanged glances, and Sarah could see the wheels turning in their heads. They were beginning to understand that what they had witnessed wasn't just a couple of lucky moves or parlor tricks. This was a comprehensive fighting system based on years of dedicated study and practice. Colonel Williams stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Ms. Martinez, would you be willing to demonstrate these multiple attacker scenarios? I think my men could benefit from seeing how someone with your skills handles more complex situations." Sarah nodded, but her expression carried a note of caution. "I'd be happy to demonstrate, but I want everyone to understand that what we're about to do will be significantly more intense than what you've seen so far. Multiple attacker scenarios require faster movements, more aggressive techniques, and split-second decision-making." The training ground buzzed with nervous energy as 5 Marines volunteered for the multiple attacker demonstration. What had started as entertainment at Sarah's expense had evolved into something none of them had anticipated. The casual mockery of 30 minutes earlier seemed like a distant memory as these seasoned combat veterans prepared to face someone who had already proven capable of surprising them. Colonel Williams established strict ground rules for the exercise. No strikes to vital areas, immediate cessation upon his command, and protective gear for all participants. Despite these precautions, an undercurrent of tension ran through the group as they realized they were about to engage in something far more serious than they had initially signed up for. The 5 volunteers formed a loose semicircle around Sarah, their positioning instinctively tactical, despite the controlled nature of the exercise. Sergeant Rodriguez stood directly in front of her, still nursing his wounded pride from their earlier encounter. To his left was Corporal Jackson, moving more cautiously now that he understood what Sarah was capable of. Private Wilson flanked her right side, his youth and inexperience evident in his slightly nervous stance. Completing the group were Sergeant Martinez and Lance Corporal Thompson, both veterans with extensive combat experience who approached this demonstration with the seriousness it deserved. Unlike their earlier dismissive attitudes, all 5 men now carried themselves with the focused intensity they would bring to an actual tactical situation. Sarah stood in the center of their formation, appearing almost impossibly small, surrounded by these trained warriors. but her posture radiated a calm confidence that seemed to fill the space around her. Her breathing was controlled and deep, her stance fluid yet grounded, and her eyes constantly moving to track the positions and movements of all 5 potential attackers. In a multiple attacker scenario, the key is never to be where your opponents expect you to be, Sarah explained to the watching crowd. Standing still means getting surrounded, which is almost always fatal. The strategy is constant movement, using one attacker as a shield against the others, and creating opportunities to eliminate threats one at a time. Colonel Williams raised his hand to signal the beginning of the exercise. The 5 Marines had agreed to attack in sequence rather than simultaneously, allowing Sarah to demonstrate specific techniques while maintaining reasonable safety margins. What none of them anticipated was how quickly the controlled demonstration would escalate beyond their carefully planned parameters. Rodriguez moved first, his approach more cautious than in their previous encounter. He had learned to respect Sarah's abilities, but his military training and masculine pride demanded that he press the attack with more intelligence and determination. His technique was sound, his movements calculated, and his guard properly maintained as he closed the distance between them. Sarah's response was immediate and devastating. Instead of waiting for Rodriguez to reach her, she exploded forward to meet his attack, closing the distance faster than he had anticipated. Her movement was so sudden and unexpected that Rodriguez had no time to adjust his strategy before finding himself caught in a complex throw that sent him tumbling across the training ground. But Sarah didn't stop to admire her work. Before Rodriguez had even hit the ground, she was already moving toward Jackson, who had begun his own attack the moment she engaged his partner. Her transition from the throw to her next technique was seamless, like watching a dancer move from one choreographed sequence to another. Jackson attempted to grab her from behind, thinking he could use his size advantage to restrain her while his teammates regrouped. Instead, he found himself on the receiving end of an elbow strike to his solar plexus that folded him in half, followed by a sweep that put him on the ground beside Rodriguez. The speed and efficiency of Sarah's movements had completely disrupted the Marines' careful planning. What was supposed to be a controlled demonstration of technique had become something resembling actual combat, with Sarah moving through her opponents like water flowing around obstacles. Private Wilson hesitated for a crucial second, uncertain whether to continue the exercise now that 2 of his fellow Marines were on the ground. That moment of indecision cost him dearly as Sarah pivoted toward him, her movement so fluid it seemed like she had anticipated his attack before he had even committed to it. The technique she used on Wilson was a perfect example of using minimal force for maximum effect. A simple redirect of his momentum combined with a pressure point strike to his neck put him down without causing serious injury. But the psychological impact on the watching Marines was enormous. Sergeant Martinez and Lance Corporal Thompson found themselves facing Sarah alone, their 3 teammates groaning on the ground behind her. The careful spacing and tactical positioning they had planned was completely disrupted, and they were forced to adapt to a situation that bore no resemblance to their original strategy. "This is what I meant about movement and positioning," Sarah called out to the watching crowd, never taking her eyes off the 2 remaining Marines. "By staying mobile and using their own positioning against them, I've turned a 5-on-1 disadvantage into a series of 1-on-1 encounters." Martinez and Thompson exchanged a quick glance, their military training taking over as they attempted to coordinate their final attack. They moved simultaneously from opposite directions, hoping to catch Sarah between them and end the demonstration before she could embarrass them as thoroughly as she had their teammates. Sarah had been waiting for exactly this moment. As the 2 Marines converged on her position, she dropped into a low crouch and spun in a complete circle, her legs sweeping out in a motion that caught both men completely off guard. The technique was called a tornado sweep in some martial arts schools, and Sarah had perfected it through years of practice against multiple opponents. Both Marines found their legs tangled with hers as her sweep disrupted their balance simultaneously. Martinez went down hard, his feet completely taken out from under him, while Thompson managed to stay upright but stumbled backward, momentarily vulnerable. Sarah flowed out of her sweep directly into a standing position behind Thompson, where a quick application of a sleeper hold rendered him unconscious for just long enough to demonstrate her point. She lowered him gently to the ground as Martinez struggled to regain his footing. Completing the demonstration, With all 5 Marines neutralized in less than 2 minutes, the training ground fell, completely silent except for the heavy breathing of the defeated Marines and the soft sound of desert wind across the base. What the assembled crowd had just witnessed defied everything they thought they understood about combat, size, strength, and tactical advantage. The aftermath of the demonstration was unlike anything anyone present had experienced. 5 highly trained Marines lay scattered across the training ground, each one trying to process what had just happened to them. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute as both participants and observers struggled to comprehend the reality of what they had witnessed. Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to speak, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and disbelief. "I've been in combat for 8 years, he said slowly, pushing himself up to a sitting position. "I've fought insurgents, trained with special forces, and thought I understood what real fighting looked like. But what just happened? I've never seen anything like that." Lance Corporal Thompson rubbed his neck where Sarah had applied the sleeper hold, his expression thoughtful rather than embarrassed. "The scary part is how controlled it all was," he observed. "She could have seriously hurt any of us at multiple points. But every technique was precise enough to neutralize without causing real damage." Colonel Williams stepped forward, his military bearing unable to completely mask his amazement. As a career officer who had witnessed countless training exercises in real combat situations, he understood the implications of what Sarah had demonstrated better than most. The efficiency, timing, and technical precision she had displayed were at a level he associated only with the most elite special operations units. "Ms. Martinez," the colonel said, his voice carrying newfound respect. "What you've just demonstrated goes far beyond what I expected when I invited you here today. The speed and effectiveness of your techniques suggest a level of training that most of my men have never encountered." Sarah helped each of the fallen Marines to their feet, her assistance both practical and symbolic. The gesture represented a bridge between the mockery that had opened their encounter and the mutual respect that was now emerging. Her movements remained fluid and controlled, showing no signs of fatigue despite having just engaged 5 opponents in rapid succession. "The most important thing to understand," Sarah addressed the gathered crowd, "is that what you've seen today isn't about me being special or having some kind of supernatural ability. It's about the power of dedicated training, proper technique, and understanding the principles that govern effective combat." Private Wilson, still shaking his head in amazement, raised his hand. "But how long does it take to develop that kind of skill? I mean, we train constantly, but nothing we do prepares us for someone who can move like that." The question opened a door for Sarah to share more about the journey that had brought her to this level of expertise. "I've been training 6 days a week for 10 years, she replied. "That's roughly 3,000 hours of dedicated practice across multiple disciplines. But more importantly, I've studied under masters who understood not just the physical techniques, but the mental and philosophical aspects that make them truly effective." She gestured toward the Marines, who were now listening with the focused attention they typically reserved for critical tactical briefings. "Your military training is excellent for what it's designed to do: operate as part of a unit, use weapons effectively, and survive in combat situations. But hand-to-hand combat is often treated as a secondary skill rather than a primary focus." Corporal Jackson, now standing and moving normally despite his earlier encounter with the ground, nodded thoughtfully. "So what you're saying is that we've been trained to fight like soldiers, but you've been trained to fight like—" "What, a warrior?" "More like an artist," Sarah corrected gently. "In traditional martial arts, combat is viewed as an art form that requires the same dedication and refinement as music or painting. Every movement has a purpose. Every technique serves multiple functions, and the ultimate goal is to achieve effectiveness through efficiency rather than force." The philosophical aspects of what Sarah was describing resonated with several of the Marines who had grown frustrated with the limitations of their standard combat training. Sergeant Martinez, who had boxed professionally before joining the military, found himself particularly intrigued by her approach to fighting as an integrated system, rather than a collection of individual techniques. "I have to ask," Martinez said, "how many people can actually do what you just did? Are there others out there with your level of skill? Or are you some kind of unique case?" Sarah's expression became more serious as she considered how to answer. "There are probably a few hundred people worldwide who could perform at this level across multiple martial arts disciplines. Most of them are either professional fighters, dedicated teachers, or individuals who have made martial arts their life's work. It's not common, but it's also not as rare as you might think. The implications of her answer weren't lost on the assembled Marines. If there were hundreds of people capable of this level of combat effectiveness, it meant that their assumptions about their own fighting abilities might be fundamentally flawed. The confidence that came from their military training suddenly seemed less absolute. Colonel Williams saw an opportunity to turn this unexpected demonstration into a valuable learning experience for his men. "Ms. Martinez, would you be willing to conduct some training sessions for my unit? It's clear that we have significant gaps in our hand-to-hand combat capabilities." Before Sarah could respond, Sergeant Rodriguez interjected with a question that had been bothering him since the demonstration began. "I have to know, when you were taking us down, were you holding back? Could you have ended those encounters even faster if you had wanted to?" The question hung in the air as everyone present realized they might not want to hear the answer. Sarah's pause before responding was telling, and when she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of absolute honesty. In a real life-or-death situation, without the constraints of this controlled demonstration, each of those encounters would have lasted less than 5 seconds, she said quietly. "The techniques I used today were chosen specifically because they neutralize opponents without causing permanent damage. There are other options available when survival is the only consideration." The sobering reality of her statement settled over the group like a cold blanket. These Marines, who prided themselves on being among the most dangerous individuals on the planet, had just learned that they might not be as formidable as they had believed. The young woman who had seemed so unimposing when she first arrived was revealing herself to be something far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. 3 months after the demonstration at Camp Pendleton, the story had become legendary throughout the Marine Corps. Word of the small woman who had single-handedly defeated 5 Marines in combat spread through military bases across the country, growing in the telling until Sarah Martinez had achieved almost mythical status among the ranks. The immediate aftermath of that day had been transformative for everyone involved. Colonel Williams had immediately arranged for Sarah to conduct a series of training seminars for his unit, and the response had been overwhelming. Marines who had initially dismissed her were now among her most dedicated students, practicing the techniques she taught with the same intensity they brought to weapons training. Sergeant Rodriguez had become perhaps Sarah's most unlikely advocate. The man who had openly mocked her skills was now studying Aikido at a civilian dojo near the base, spending his off-duty hours learning the principles of redirection and minimal force that had so thoroughly defeated him. His transformation from skeptic to student had influenced many of his fellow Marines to reconsider their own assumptions about combat effectiveness. "She taught me that everything I thought I knew about fighting was incomplete," Rodriguez explained to a group of new recruits who had heard about the legendary demonstration. "Size and strength matter, but technique and timing matter more. When someone has both skill and the element of surprise, physical advantages become meaningless." The training program Sarah had developed for the Marines incorporated elements from multiple martial arts disciplines, adapted specifically for military applications. Her approach focused on practical techniques that could be learned relatively quickly, while building the foundation for more advanced skills over time. The results had been remarkable, with the unit showing significant improvement in hand-to-hand combat assessments. But perhaps the most significant change had been in the Marines' mindset about underestimating opponents. The lesson Sarah had taught them extended far beyond martial arts techniques to encompass a fundamental shift in how they evaluated threats and prepared for unknown situations. The assumption that appearance accurately reflected capability had been permanently shattered. Corporal Jackson, who had been promoted to sergeant in the months following the demonstration, found himself applying Sarah's teachings in ways that extended beyond physical combat. "She showed us that preconceptions are dangerous," he reflected. "Whether you're sizing up an enemy combatant or working with local civilians in a deployment zone, making assumptions based on appearance can get you killed." The story had also reached the highest levels of military command, with several generals requesting briefings on the training techniques Sarah had demonstrated. Her approach to combat efficiency was being studied as a potential enhancement to standard military training protocols, and she'd been invited to demonstrate her skills at facilities across the country. For Sarah herself, the experience at Camp Pendleton had been both validating and humbling. The initial mockery had stung, but the transformation she witnessed in the Marines afterward had reminded her why she had dedicated her life to martial arts in the first place. The opportunity to share knowledge and change perspectives was worth more than any championship trophy or teaching certificate. That day taught me as much as it taught them, Sarah reflected during a later interview. I learned that even the most skeptical students can become dedicated practitioners when they see undeniable evidence of what's possible. The Marines' willingness to admit they were wrong and commit to learning something new showed incredible character. The ripple effects of the demonstration continued to spread throughout the military community. Other service branches began requesting similar training programs, and Sarah found herself consulting with elite units who wanted to incorporate her techniques into their special operations training. What had started as a simple demonstration had evolved into a comprehensive examination of how the military approached hand-to-hand combat. The 5 Marines who had participated in the original demonstration each carried the experience with them as they continued their military careers. Private Wilson, who had hesitated during the multiple attacker scenario, became one of the most dedicated students in Sarah's training program, eventually earning his black belt in 2 different martial arts disciplines while still serving active duty. Lance Corporal Thompson, who had been rendered unconscious by Sarah's sleeper hold, became an instructor himself, teaching the techniques he had learned to other Marines and emphasizing the importance of respecting every opponent regardless of their appearance. His experiences that day had taught him that overconfidence could be as dangerous as any enemy weapon. The training ground at Camp Pendleton, where the demonstration had taken place, became an unofficial shrine to the lessons Sarah had taught. New recruits were brought there to hear the story of the small woman who had defeated 5 Marines, and the tale served as a powerful reminder that assumptions about capability could be both foolish and dangerous. Years later, when military historians studied the evolution of combat training in the early 21st century, they would point to Sarah Martinez's demonstration at Camp Pendleton as a turning point. The event had challenged fundamental assumptions about physical combat and forced the military to reconsider how it prepared soldiers for hand-to-hand encounters. The legend of that day lived on in countless retellings, each version emphasizing different aspects of what had transpired. Some focused on the technical brilliance of Sarah's techniques, others on the humility shown by the Marines in accepting their defeat and learning from it. But all versions carried the same essential message: never judge capability by appearance, and always remain open to learning from unexpected sources. Sarah continued her martial arts journey, eventually opening her own training academy, where she taught both military personnel and civilians. The academy's motto, inscribed above the entrance, read simply, "Strength comes in many forms." It served as a daily reminder of the lesson she had taught that dusty afternoon at Camp Pendleton, when a small woman had changed the way an entire military unit thought about combat, respect, and the dangerous assumptions that come from judging others by their appearance. The 5 Marines who had volunteered for that demonstration never forgot the experience. They carried the lesson with them throughout their careers, sharing the story with fellow service members and using it as a teaching tool for new recruits. The day they had been knocked out by someone they had initially dismissed as harmless had become one of the most valuable learning experiences of their military service. In the end, what had started as mockery had become mutual respect. Skepticism had transformed into admiration, and assumptions had given way to understanding. The training ground at Camp Pendleton had witnessed more than just a demonstration of martial arts techniques that day. It had been the site of a profound lesson about the dangers of preconceptions and the power of keeping an open mind, even when faced with something that challenged everything you thought you knew about strength, skill, and capability.